Hello, young soul. Welcome to the Terror Diary. Airbnbs are often temporary places, but some stories that happen there linger forever. Not every guest leaves unscathed, and some doors should never be opened. The first story today is about Lucas, who just wanted a few days of peace. But the house he rented had a secret behind a locked door. A secret that didn't want to stay inside. This happened to me when I lived in the countryside. I never told anyone, but sometimes I feel like it's still not over. I wish I could say this. Story is in the past, that it was just a scare. But I would be lying. It was a few years ago when I decided to get away from the city. I rented a house through Airbnb, a quiet place, surrounded by trees, perfect for remote work and rest. The host, a man named Damio, seemed friendly, but he wasn't much for conversation. When he handed me the key, he made just one request. "You can use everything, but don't go into the back room. It's a storage, just old junk. It's locked, so you don't need to worry about it." At the time, I wasn't bothered. Every house has a messy corner, right? But that first night, I heard the sound, a scratching, slow, deep, coming from the other side of the locked door. And that's how it all began. The sound was faint at first, so subtle that for a moment I thought I imagined it. But then it came again, scratching, slow, deliberate. You know how a dog wants to get in and scratches its nails on the door? It was like that, but there was something strange. The rhythm was calculated, methodical, as if it knew I was listening. The back room, the locked door. My breath caught in my throat, but trying to stay calm, I let out a nervous laugh. It must be a rat, or wood creaking. These old houses make noise, right? But then came the second sound, whispers, low, almost imperceptible, as if someone was speaking from the other side of the door but didn't want to be heard. My skin crawled from head to toe. I grabbed my phone and turned on the flashlight, even though I didn't know exactly what I was looking for. I walked down the hallway, the floor creaking beneath my feet. The sound had stopped. Everything seemed normal until I saw it, the padlock. It was turned. Not broken, not opened, just turned. The wrong way, as if someone had tried to force it from the inside. A cold shiver ran down my spine. I swallowed hard and took a step back, my heart pounding in my chest. That's when something hit the other side of the door. A dry thud, loud. I dropped my phone to the floor. My heart raced. The noise behind the door ceased, but the silence was worse. I bent down to pick up my phone, my hands trembling. I wanted to get out of there, text the host, do anything. But then, the padlock fell to the ground. It didn't open. It wasn't ripped off. It just fell, as if it had never been closed correctly. The door previously locked creaked slightly as it opened. A sour smell of sweat and dampness escaped from inside. And then, I saw. In the darkness of the room, two silhouettes glimmered, reflecting the light from my flashlight. Eyes. Human eyes. My mind refused to process it. My body acted first. I turned on my heels and ran. The hallway seemed longer than before, the furniture distorted like living shadows around me. I reached the front door and pulled the handle. Locked. I hadn't locked. My breath became shallow. My fingers were sweating as I tried to turn the key in the lock. Behind me, the sound of heavy footsteps dragged across the wooden floor. Closer. Faster. The adrenaline blinded me. I kicked the door, slammed it with my shoulders. Nothing. That's when I felt it. Hands. Cold, bony, with thick nails that dug into my skin and pulled my neck back. I let out a muffled scream, pain throbbing where the fingers tightened. "You shouldn't have come in here." The voice was rough, hoarse. Before I could react, something heavy struck my head. A dry impact. Pain exploded behind my eyes and everything went black. I woke up with a dry mouth and the smell of mold stuffed in my nostrils. My arms were numb. I tried to move them, but they were bound. Ropes. A wave of overwhelming panic engulfed my entire body. The room was dark except for a dim lamp hanging from the ceiling, and in the shadows, he was there, a tall, thin man dressed in filthy clothes, his face obscured by an old leather mask, stitched with something that looked like human hair. He was sharpening a blade, a knife. The sound of metal grinding against. The sharpening stone sliced through the silence, slow and meticulous. "You shouldn't have come," he repeated, not looking at me. "But since you did, let's have some fun." My throat closed up. The chair I was in creaked under my weight as I thrashed. It was useless. The ropes cut into my skin. The man stood up slowly, holding the blade delicately as if it were a treasure. He walked toward me, his steps slow, calculated. "Do you know what I like?" He tilted his head. Silence. With a quick motion, he plunged the blade into my shoulder. The pain was electric, slicing through my flesh like fire. A scream escaped my throat, but he merely smiled behind the mask. "But you—" He twisted the knife inside the wound. "You make a lot of noise." My eyes watered. Warm blood trickled down my chest. I needed to get out of there, but how? The pain was unbearable. A feverish heat rose up my arm as blood stained my shirt. The metallic smell filled my nostrils. He stepped back a few paces, watching me like a hunter savoring the suffering of his prey. "Have you ever been close to death before?" he asked, twirling the knife between his fingers. "It's funny. Everyone acts the same way. First they try to fight." He pointed the blade at me, tracing the air as if drawing something invisible. "Then they beg." Bile rose in my throat. Every inch of my body trembled, but I couldn't show fear. If he wanted to see my despair, I wouldn't give him that satisfaction. Instead, my mind raced frantically. I needed to get out of there. Now. My eyes scanned the surroundings. The room was small, dirty, with shelves full of rusty things and dusty boxes. A wooden table in the corner was cluttered with tools, pliers, saws, nails. And then I saw it, a shard of glass. It was near my foot, almost imperceptible among the shadows. I took a deep breath, trying to ignore the throbbing pain in my shoulder. I moved my leg slowly, sliding my foot to reach the glass. My heart raced, so loudly I thought he might hear it. "You don't talk much, do you?" He leaned in again, tilting his head. "That's good. The screaming gets annoying after a while." I forced myself to keep a neutral expression as my toes pulled the shard of glass toward my hand. He crouched down to my level. The eyes behind the mask were cold, empty. "But you know what bothers me more?" he whispered. "Curious people. That's—" When he moved the knife again, too quickly, it slid across my face, a clean cut on my cheek. The sting came right after, and hot blood trickled into my mouth. I bit my lip to keep from screaming. He laughed, satisfied with my suffering. But he didn't notice. My hand already held the glass. With a swift motion, I twisted my wrist and drove the shard into his leg with all the strength I could muster. He screamed. A roar of pain and rage. He staggered back, knocking over a chair. Was my chance. With blood flowing from the wounds, I used the distraction to cut the rope binding my wrists. My fingers were numb, but I kept sawing until the knot came undone. I was free. He was still trying to pull the glass from his leg, groaning in pain. I didn't wait. I lunged at him, grabbing the knife he had dropped. He reacted quickly. He pushed me hard, throwing me against the wall. The impact darkened my vision for a second, but I forced myself to carry on. I needed to survive. I needed to kill him. With a scream, I gripped the knife and plunged it into his chest. This time it was him who screamed. His eyes widened, and he tried to say something, but all that came out was a choked gasp. The silence he loved so much finally swallowed him whole. I ran out of the house, stumbling in the darkness, the smell of blood still clinging to me. My vision was blurry, my breath short. The front door was unlocked now. I reached the dirt road and kept running until I found help. The police came the next morning. They searched the place. They found the back door, the dungeon, the remains of previous victims. And they found him. But what haunts me to this day is not what they did to him. It's what they told me. The host, Damião, never existed. The name of the homeowner, it was the same name as the man I tried to kill that night. And the worst part? The body was never found. The police searched for him for weeks. They scoured every corner of that filthy house, reopened old missing persons cases in the area, alerted the residents, but they never found the body. The remains in the morgue belonged to previous victims, all listed as missing for years. But him, he simply vanished. My mind refused to accept the truth. I saw him die. I killed him. So why a few weeks later in my new apartment did a package arrive with no return address? Inside there was only one object, the house key, and tied to it with a dirty string, a handwritten note. Thank you for letting me in. The silence in the hallways. The strange noise at night. A room the host insists you don't need to open. When you rent an Airbnb, you never really know who was there before you. Or worse, who might still be inside. Maybe you'll get lucky and come out unscathed. Or maybe someone is waiting just for you. And you? Have you ever experienced something strange in an Airbnb, or gone through a creepy encounter elsewhere? Share your story in the comments or send your account to our email, available in the description. Who knows? The next story told here might be yours. The worst kind of terror is the one that starts slowly. A strange detail here, a noise there, until suddenly you realize you're not alone anymore. Everyone has a strange story to tell, something that doesn't make sense, something we try to forget or explain rationally. But there are certain things that simply don't fit. It was a friend of mine, Edu, who told me this one. He's not the type to get scared easily. He always thought these ghost stories were nonsense, claiming everything had a logical explanation. But after what happened to him, he never slept in a cheap Airbnb again. And if you'll allow me to give a piece of advice before continuing this story, maybe you should avoid that too. Edu was traveling alone. He had managed to take a few days off work and decided to make a quick trip to relax. No expensive hotels, he just needed a place to sleep and store his things. He found a cheap Airbnb in a large house from one of those hosts who rent a room while living in the same place. The house looked normal in the photos, simple but cozy. The host, a man named Ricardo, had good reviews. Good guy, respectful, hardly ever home, the comments said. It seemed perfect. But according to Edu, the strange feeling began as soon as he arrived. The neighborhood was too quiet. Not the pleasant silence of a peaceful place, but a heavy emptiness, as if no one really lived there. When Ricardo opened the door, Edu sensed a strange smell. Not dirt, but something stagnant, as if the house had been closed for a long time. Ricardo was polite, but there was something about him that made Edu uneasy. Maybe it was the way he spoke. Too slowly, as if he was always choosing his words carefully. Or the fact that his eyes seemed to never focus directly on him. The room was small, but it felt comfortable. A double bed, an old desk, and a full-length mirror in the corner. The only thing that bothered him was the closet door. It was crooked, as if someone had forced the lock at some point. Edu tossed his backpack on the bed and went to take a shower. When he came out of the bathroom, he noticed that the closet door was slightly ajar. He was sure it had been closed before. He reached for the doorknob, pushed it slowly, and looked inside. Nothing much, just a few empty hangers, a stack of towels, and a faint smell of mildew. He shut the door more firmly this time. Maybe it was just stuck. That night, Ricardo said he would go out to meet some friends and wouldn't be back until the next day. Edu felt relieved. Despite the good price, he never liked the idea of sharing a house with a stranger. He ordered food, watched something on his phone, and went to sleep. And then came the voice. It was a whisper, low, dragged out, right next to his ear. He jolted awake, heart racing. The room was dark. The silence was absolute. He looked around, trying to understand if he had been dreaming. The door was still closed. No strange shadows. Nothing moving. But the mirror. The full-length mirror, which was in the corner, was turned toward the bed. Edu was sure it hadn't been like that before. The air in the room felt heavier. Edu felt a chill run up his spine, one of those shivers that doesn't come just from the temperature, but from something deeper. more instinctual. He stood still for a while, listening to his heart pounding in his chest. The whisper still echoed, in his head, but now everything was silent. Too silent. The house was old, it should have normal noises, wood creaking, pipes groaning. But there was nothing, not even the wind, not the distant sound of a car on the street, just absolute emptiness. Edu's eyes returned to the mirror. It had been slightly turned toward the wall, at an angle that didn't reflect the bed. Now it was pointing directly at him. He didn't want to get up. Something inside him screamed to stay where he was, quiet, pretending he hadn't noticed anything. But he needed to check. With his breath caught in his chest, he reached for his phone and turned on the flashlight. The dim light illuminated the reflection in the mirror. His own image was there, lying down, wide-eyed, looking as scared as he felt. But something seemed off. He blinked. The reflection didn't. Panic tightened his chest like a closed fist. Instinct took over, and he turned the mirror to the wall with a swift motion. The impact made the wood creak, echoing through the silent house. He sat on the bed, trying to calm himself. It was just my head. It was just my head. But then he heard it. A faint tick, tick, coming from the wardrobe, as if someone was scraping a nail against the wood. Slow, almost careful. Edu froze, his eyes fixated. On the wardrobe door, the same one he had closed earlier, the sound stopped, and then very slowly the door began to open, by itself. A crack, then a little more, enough for the darkness inside to seem to expand, mingling with that of the room. Edu sensed a strange smell coming from there. It wasn't mold. It was something denser, more humid. Before he could react, a whisper crawled through the air again, low and rough, coming from inside the wardrobe. "Why did you move the mirror?" Edu's heart stopped. He didn't wait to see what would come out. On impulse, he jumped from the bed, ran to the door, and opened it in a desperate motion. The hallway was dark, but he knew the way. He dashed to the living room, tripping on the rug, daring not to look back. The house was cold, freezing, the kind of cold that isn't natural. He reached the front door and tried to turn the doorknob, locked, behind him. Something moved in the hallway. Footsteps. Edu turned the key with all his strength, feeling the metal cut into his palm from pressing so hard. The door opened. He ran down the sidewalk, not looking back, not thinking, not breathing properly. He only stopped when he was several blocks away, trembling, his face sweaty and pale. The next morning, he returned with a friend to collect his things. Ricardo, the host, was already there. "Hey man, what happened? You vanished." Edu looked at him, unsure where to begin. "What time did you get here?" was the only thing he could ask. Ricardo frowned. "This morning. I texted you to let you know. I've been out since last night." Edu felt his blood run cold. He wanted to tell, wanted to explain everything, but when he looked inside the house, he saw the mirror in the hallway, facing the door, reflecting something that shouldn't be there. Edu didn't respond. He just stood at the door, staring at the mirror at the end of the hallway. Ricardo kept talking, asking if something had happened, but his voice sounded distant, muffled, as if he were underwater. The mirror. It wasn't his own image he saw there. There was something more, a distorted shadow, a human outline standing in the back of the reflection, where the hallway should have been empty. And then it moved, slowly, almost imperceptibly, but it moved. Fear tightened Edu's stomach, a nausea rising in his throat. He quickly averted his gaze, taking a deep breath, trying to ignore the shiver creeping up his neck. "Dude." Ricardo touched his shoulder, and Edu jumped. "Are you okay?" Edu forced a smile, one of those automatic smiles you give when you're trying to hide pure panic. Just didn't sleep well. "Want to grab your stuff?" He wanted to, needed to, but at the same time, the mere thought of stepping back into that house made every muscle in his body scream to run. But he couldn't leave without his backpack. His phone, wallet, everything was still in the room, so he took a deep breath and went in. With each step he took down the hallway, he felt the air change, becoming heavier, denser, as if he were walking against an invisible tide. The sounds seemed muffled. The daylight coming through the windows didn't seem to reach the shadows inside the house. The room was just as he left it, except for one thing: the mirror. It was no longer facing the wall. Someone had put it back in its original position. Edu felt a knot in his stomach. He didn't think twice. He grabbed the backpack haphazardly, not caring if everything was inside or not. He didn't look at the mirror. He didn't want to see if the reflection was still wrong. As he was about to leave the room, he noticed something. The closet door, which had been open, was now closed, and on the doorknob, imprinted in the dust accumulated on the wood, fingerprints, too small to be Ricardo's or his, thin, elongated fingerprints, as if something had held the door shut from the inside before closing it. Edu left the room so fast he almost tripped. He walked straight past Ricardo, who was still asking what had happened, and exited through the door without looking back. He never booked an Airbnb again. And to this day, when he sees a full-length mirror in some hotel room or unfamiliar house, he turns to the wall. Just to be sure. Edu never spoke about that night again. Not with me, nor with anyone. He tried to move on, to forget. But some things don't let you forget. A few weeks later, he received an email from Airbnb. It was an automatic notification asking if he wanted to review his stay. He almost ignored it. Almost let it go. But something bothered him. He wanted to know if others had experienced something strange in that house, so he opened the listing page, but Airbnb no longer existed. Ricardo's profile, the house, the reviews, everything had vanished, as if it had never been there. At first, Edu felt relieved. Maybe someone had reported the place, maybe Ricardo himself had removed the listing. But then, out of curiosity, he did something he shouldn't have done. He searched for the address on Google and found a news article. The house had been closed for years. The last registered resident was a man named Ricardo, but he had died in a fire over a decade ago. Edu closed the laptop immediately. Since then, every time he has to travel, he chooses to pay a little more and stay in a hotel. Ordinary rooms, no old wardrobes, no large mirrors. Because sometimes when he sees himself reflected in a mirror, he realizes he is not alone. And if you think this was the worst thing that ever happened in an Airbnb, you might want to hear the next story. See if you've ever had that feeling of being watched. Maybe it's because you really are. My grandfather told me that once when I was a child. At the time, I thought it was just another one of his strange sayings, but many years later, I heard a story that made me remember those words. A friend of mine told me. He's not the type to get carried away by nonsense, but that night, it was clear something had changed in him. It happened to a friend of his, Camila. Camila had always been cautious. Before booking any place to travel, she would spend hours reading reviews, analyzing photos, checking every detail as if her life depended on it. That weekend, she wanted something secluded, away from the noise of the city, and found the perfect cabin, or at least it seemed so. The place was small but cozy. Rustic wood, warm lights, a fireplace that looked straight out of a movie. The host had good reviews in the past, but something caught her attention. The last review left just a few days ago. Just a short sentence with no explanation, no context. Leave before 3 a.m. She laughed. It had to be a joke. Some idiot trying to scare the other guests. Still, just to be safe, she asked the host. He quickly assured her that there had never been any issues, that someone must have written that for fun or revenge. You can relax, he said. The cabin is safe. And it really seemed so, at least at first. On the first night, Camilla lit the fireplace, opened a bottle of wine, and settled on the couch, listening only to the wind blowing through the trees. Everything was quiet, too quiet. It was only when she looked at the clock that she realized 2:47 a.m. And then, something changed. The fire in the fireplace flickered, as if a breeze had passed through. but all the windows were closed. The air grew denser, as if the cabin itself was holding its breath. In the silence, she heard a crack. It wasn't coming from outside, nor from the ceiling. It was coming from the floor. Camilla held her breath, her heart pounding in her chest. The cabin was old, the wood creaked easily, but this sound wasn't random. It didn't happen by chance, it was rhythmic, footsteps, slow, precise, coming from beneath her. And then something even worse happened. The noise stopped, right beneath the couch where she was sitting. Camilla froze. The air inside the cabin felt heavier, as if something invisible filled the space around her. The silence was absolute, but it wasn't an ordinary silence. It was that kind of silence that weighs on your ears, that makes your heart beat louder than it should. A silence that wasn't empty. It seemed to be waiting for something. She didn't want to move. She didn't even want to breathe. The digital clock on the table shone in the dark, displaying a number impossible to ignore. 57 minutes until 3 a.m. The footsteps she had heard before seemed to come from underneath the floor, right beneath the sofa where she was sitting. But that didn't make sense. The cabin was single-story. There was no basement. The fire in the fireplace flickered weakly, casting elongated shadows on the wooden walls. Camilla tried to convince herself it was just her imagination. The wood must have been expanding with the heat, or perhaps a small animal was trapped in some gap in the structure. She grabbed her phone, turned on the flashlight and crouched down slowly, peering under the sofa. Nothing. Just darkness, swallowing the space between the floor and the furniture. But when she sat back up, she noticed one thing. The entire cabin was shrouded in dimness except for one detail, the gap of the kitchen door. The narrow crack beneath the door should have been dark, but it wasn't. There was something there, a shadow, as if something on the other side was standing in front of the door, waiting. Camilla's throat went dry. Her body screamed to run, but run where? Outside there was only the cold of the forest and a dirt road winding for miles to the nearest town. The clock on her phone changed. 6 a.m. The silence of the cabin was broken, not by a creak, not by footsteps, but by a much worse sound. Something was scratching at the wood of the door, slow, methodical, like short nails scraping against the varnish. Camilla gripped her phone tightly, feeling her chest rise and fall in a frantic rhythm. Her brain screamed not to do it, to ignore it, to just close her eyes and hope it would pass. But she couldn't help it. She turned the flashlight of her phone toward the door. The beam of light cut through the dimness and illuminated the crack. It was just a second, but it was enough to see. There, in the small space between the floor and the door, was an eye staring back at her. Camilla didn't scream. She couldn't. The shock froze her breath, paralyzed her muscles. Everything inside her begged for this to be a mistake, a reflection, some play of shadows. But it wasn't. The eye was still there, blinking slowly, watching. The flashlight trembled in her hand. The dark, dilated pupil of that eye seemed to draw her in. It didn't move, didn't look away, just remained there, waiting. Then came the sound, low, raspy, a laugh. It wasn't human, not really. It was something distorted, choked, as if the throat trying to produce that noise wasn't used to laughing. Camilla felt bile rise. Her mind screamed that this couldn't be real. The cabin was small. She was alone. She was alone. Right? 58 am 2 minutes left. The sound of the wood being scratched started again, but now it came from several places at once. Walls, ceiling, under the sofa, inside the cabinets. The world around her creaked, cracked, as if the cabin itself was folding in on itself. Camilla stood up so quickly that the phone fell from her hand. The beam of light swept through the room, illuminating pieces of the environment erratically. The fireplace, the armchair, the table, and then the door. The crack was empty. The eye had vanished. But the doorknob was turning. The dry sound of metal echoed through the cabin, enough to break the trance. Camilla's body reacted before her mind could process. She ran, didn't think, didn't grab her phone, just ran to the bedroom and locked the door, Her heart hammered against her ribs. She pressed her ear against the wood, holding her breath, waiting. Waiting for what? Nothing. Silence returned. But this time, it was a different silence. Because now, there was something on the other side of the door. Camilla felt it. The wood was cold against her skin. But something on the other side was warm, and breathing. She shut her eyes tightly, tried to convince herself it was just paranoia, that it was all an illusion caused by fear. And then, on the other side of the door, someone whispered, softly, hoarsely, almost lovingly, "It's past 3. Camilla recoiled from the door, as if she had been burned. The whisper still echoed in her mind, brushing against her skin like a cold breath. "It's past 3. I looked around. The room was small, furnished only with a bed, a dresser, and an old mirror leaning against the wall. The window, the only exit besides the door, was closed. Locked, right? Her bare feet touched the wooden floor as she slowly moved to check. Each step seemed too loud in the oppressive silence. With trembling hands, she pulled the latch and pushed the window. Nothing. It wouldn't open. It was stuck. Camilla swallowed, hard, her eyes returning to the bedroom door. It was still closed, but something felt different. The weak moonlight filtered through the cracks of the window, illuminating the floor. But the crack under the door was completely dark, as if something on the other side blocked the light. Camilla stepped back, her body shaking. The phone was still in the living room. Outside, something was waiting, something that knew she was there. And then came the worst sound she had ever heard in her life. Slow, dragging, the sound of someone kneeling on the other side of the door. The wood groaned under the weight. The silence of the cabin became an absolute void. Camilla held her breath, every cell in her body begging for it not to be real. But then she heard it, a nail scratching the door, not fast, not violent, slow, deliberate, as if it were calling, as if it knew that sooner or later she would open. Camilla squeezed her eyes shut, her hands covering her mouth to stifle any sound. The scratching continued. Once, twice, 3 times. Then silence. And then the whisper came again. This time, inside the room. You took your time. The mirror. Camilla turned, her heart stopping for a second. The mirror leaning against the wall now reflected something that shouldn't be there. A tall shadow, disproportionate, bent, as if she had just emerged from a space too small for her, and where there should have been a face, there was only one eye. The same one that had been spying on her through the crack of the door, winking, smiling. Camilla didn't scream. She couldn't. Her lungs were empty, her heart racing too fast. She felt her body give way, her knees failing as if the ground beneath her wasn't real. But the reflection in the mirror was real. That was real. The shadow leaned in slowly as if studying her. The dark, deep eye pulsed like an endless void. And then the thing smiled. Camilla didn't see lips, but she felt the smile. A pressure in her head, in the bones of her face, at the base of her neck, like something was smiling inside her. She stumbled backward, her vision blurred by panic. Her shoulder hit the bedroom door. The wood gave way, but not inward. The door opened by itself. The hallway was dark, darker than it should have been. The cabin seemed to have changed. The fireplace, the table, the sofa where she had been before were gone. The floor stretched into an endless void. The walls shrank, as if the space had been swallowed by something much larger. And then, deep in the darkness, she saw the front door. Open. Outside, the forest waited. Camilla didn't think. She ran. Every step felt wrong. The air was heavy, dense, as if something was pulling her back. She knew she couldn't look in the mirror again. She knew that thing was still there. But at the last second, as she passed through the front door, as her feet touched the cold earth of the road, she looked, and the cabin was empty. The lights were off. The door, which a second before had been open, was now closed and locked. Camilla turned and ran without looking back. She ran until her legs gave out, until she tasted blood in her mouth. She only stopped when she saw lights, when she spotted the city. when she knew she was far enough away. The next morning, she packed her things and left. But before she went, she did one last thing. She opened the app, found the listing for the cabin, and left a review. Leave before 3 a.m. An Airbnb apartment. Seems perfect for a quiet night, but when the new guest realizes the bed has been slept in and the TV turns on by itself at 2:45 a.m., she starts to wonder. Is she really alone? If you have the courage, keep listening to the next stories. But if not, it's better to stop here, because from now on, it only gets worse. And remember, just because you're in the comfort of your home doesn't mean you're safe. I heard this story from someone who would never lie about something like that, and the worst part, I know he's not making it up. Pedro told me this on some random night after a few beers, with that expression of someone wanting to get rid of a weight. He wasn't the type to make up stories, nor was he easily impressed, but that night he seemed different. He told me he never wanted to talk about what happened in that cabin. Mariana also refuses to touch the subject, but the way he told it in his low voice, his eyes always averting the window, I believed every word. And when he finished, I realized I was looking out my own window, unintentionally, without thinking, but afraid of what I might see. Pedro took a deep breath before continuing. He and Mariana had rented a secluded cabin deep in a dense forest for a weekend getaway. They wanted a quiet place away from the city, just the two of them and the silence of nature. The host, an older man with a deep, calm voice, handed over the keys and asked just one thing. If you hear noises outside at night, don't look out the window. Pedro laughed, thinking it was just a way to scare them or at most a warning about some wild animal lurking nearby. Mariana, more skeptical, asked what that meant, but the host simply repeated, with a look that left no room for jokes. Don't look out the window. They didn't take the warning seriously. Not at the time. The cabin was cozy, rustic, with dark wooden furniture and a faint scent of pine and a cold fireplace. The windows were large, without curtains, providing an amazing view of the trees, but also letting in the heavy darkness of the forest at night. And it was on the first night that the noises began. Outside, something was moving among the trees. First light footsteps on the dry grass, then a slow dragging sound, as if something or someone was circling the cabin. Mariana locked the door and laughed nervously. It must be an animal, she said, but her voice trembled. Pedro tried to ignore it. But then came the sound of something scraping against the wooden wall of the cabin. Something that sounded like fingers. They looked at each other, holding their breath. The guy warned us, Mariana whispered. Don't look. Pedro didn't look, not that night, but on the second night he couldn't resist. The noises returned, louder. Now there were heavy footsteps circling the cabin as if they were waiting for something. There was a low sound, almost a whisper carried by the wind, words he couldn't understand, and then came the knock. Soft, on the living room window. 3 slow taps. Pedro held his breath. Mariana curled up beside him. Neither of them moved. The knock came again. Slow, deliberate. Pedro closed his eyes. The host had warned him. He knew he shouldn't look, but in that thick silence, between the sound of something dragging outside and the cold that seemed to seep through the walls, he looked. And what he saw made his blood run cold. The first thing Pedro saw was a figure, tall, too thin, standing just beyond the window. The darkness of the forest swallowed its shape, but the faint light of the moon outlined its contour. It shouldn't have been possible, but he felt that the thing was staring at him, even without seeing any eyes. The silhouette wasn't exactly human. The shoulders were bony, disproportionate to the slender body. The arms seemed too long, hanging by the body in an unnatural way. And then it moved, slowly, as if it knew Pedro was watching, as if it was waiting. He felt his chest tighten. A strange chill crept up his spine, as if an invisible weight was hanging on his back. His breath became short, the air heavy in his lungs, and then the fingers began to move. Pale fingers, too thin, with long nails glistening in the dim light. They slid across the glass in a slow, dragging motion, producing a high-pitched sound that made Pedro shudder. It was at that moment that Mariana noticed. Pedro. Her voice came out low, cutting, as if she already knew. He wanted to say it was fine, that there was nothing there. But his body was frozen, his gaze locked onto that thing outside. And then something happened that made him hold his breath. The thing smiled. It shouldn't have been possible. The face was just a shadow in the darkness, without defined features. But Pedro was sure, absolutely sure, that it was smiling at him. A wide, grotesque smile that had no shape, but that he felt nonetheless. That's when Mariana pulled his arm hard. "Don't look," her voice cut through the trance. Pedro blinked, feeling his heart pounding inside his chest. When he looked again, there was nothing there. Just darkness still, as if it had never been disturbed, but the mark of the fingers was still on the window. And then came the last thing. The whisper. A low, hoarse voice that seemed to come from everywhere at once. "Now I know you saw me." Pedro had never felt fear like he did in that moment, because he understood something very simple, something the host already knew, and that they had ignored. The thing outside only existed if you looked at it. And now, it knew he looked. Pedro couldn't move. The room seemed to shrink around him, the shadows stretching on the walls, reaching out like invisible fingers ready to grab him. Mariana gripped his arm tightly, her fingers digging into his skin, trembling without saying anything. The silence was now absolute. The wind outside had stopped. The trees didn't move. Even the crickets, which had filled the night with their incessant chirping, fell silent as if something larger, something much older, had taken over the atmosphere. But Pedro knew they weren't alone. "We need to get out of here," Mariana whispered. He nodded but couldn't take his eyes off the window. The glass still had marks, thin and irregular, as if something had dragged its fingers across it. But now, looking closely, Pedro realized that the marks were not just fingerprints or dirt. They formed something. Words. Words written on the glass. "I see you." The terror gripped his chest like a cold fist. Mariana saw it too, and her breathing grew shallower. "Don't look over there." She pulled Pedro away forcefully. He averted his gaze, but something inside him said it was too late. Outside, the footsteps started again, slow, dragging, circling the cabin, as if the thing was savoring the moment, no longer trying to hide, no longer waiting. It knew he looked, and now it was just getting closer. Mariana ran to the door, twisting the key desperately. The wood creaked as she yanked the doorknob, but the door wouldn't budge. Locked. "What? I just unlocked this." She twisted the knob hard, her eyes wide. Pedro tried to help, but the lock wouldn't give, as if something were holding the door from the other side. And then came the knock. No longer on the window. Now, on the door. Low, deliberate. Knock, knock, knock. Mariana stifled a scream. Pedro stepped back, feeling the air around him grow denser. And then the voice came, low, distorted, as if whispered through a broken radio. "Let me in." Pedro and Mariana froze. The ensuing silence was absolute, as if even time had stopped. The cabin was shut, locked. But they both knew that didn't matter, because it didn't need doors to enter. It was already inside. The silence that followed that whisper was the worst of all. There were no more footsteps outside, no knocking on the door, no voice, just the muffled sound of Mariana's and Pedro's, breathing, gasping and trembling, as they huddled against the wall opposite the entrance. But the silence didn't mean they were alone. Pedro felt it first, a weight in the air, an invisible presence pressing on their shoulders, making the room smaller, colder. It was as if something were watching them closely, very closely, and liked what it saw. Then Mariana let out an almost inaudible whisper, "Pedro." She was no longer looking at the door, nor at the window. She was looking at the mirror. The only mirror in the cabin, hanging on the wall opposite the bed. Small, oval, old. Pedro had never paid attention to it before. But now he realized there was something more reflected there. In the mirror behind them, the shadow loomed, tall, distorted, much closer than anything should be. It wasn't just a figure, it was a hole in reality, an absence of light, of color, of anything that made sense. And it was smiling, a wide, impossible smile forming out of nothing, long, irregular teeth emerging from the dark. Mariana covered her mouth to avoid screaming. Pedro felt his legs weaken. He didn't want to look, but now that he had seen, he couldn't look away. And then the eyes appeared, not in their reflection, not in the terrified faces of Pedro and Mariana. The eyes appeared within the mirror, black, deep, bottomless, endless. The kind of gaze that doesn't reflect light. It devours it. Pedro felt his body being pulled. Not physically, but as if something invisible was trying to tear him from within himself. "I see you." The voice did not come from the mirror. It came from inside his head. And then the mirror cracked. A dry, cutting sound, a snap that made both of them jump back. The fissures spread like poisoned roots, but the reflection remained. The smile was still there. And the eyes were now everywhere. Pedro grabbed Mariana by the wrist and did the only thing they could do. They ran. Pedro and Mariana ran without thinking, without looking back. The hallway seemed longer than before, as if the very cabin was stretching, trying to keep them inside. The front door was still locked. Mariana twisted the doorknob desperately while Pedro tried to open one of the windows, but none of them would budge. And then came that sound, a dry snap, like wood breaking. Pedro turned his head slowly, his heart pounding in his throat. The mirror. It was no longer just cracked, it was opening. The fissures grew until the surface began to crumble inward, as if the glass wasn't just breaking, but transforming into a passage. Something was coming out. Thin, pale fingers stretched outward. The wide, misshapen smile widened even more, curving in a way that human flesh never could. And then the black eyes turned directly to Pedro. "Now you've brought me here." The voice did not come from the mirror. It came from inside the room. Pedro and Mariana finally screamed. The glass exploded into 1,000 pieces, and for a second Pedro saw, truly saw, what was coming out. It wasn't just a shadow. It was something ancient, something formless, without a real face, but with many. As if multiple expressions could form in that dark nothingness simultaneously. He saw mouths where there shouldn't be mouths, hands where there shouldn't be hands. And then, everything stopped. Silence returned like a wave, and Pedro and Mariana were outside the cabin. Suddenly, without remembering how, without recalling having left, they were outside, their feet on the cold grass, the icy wind cutting against their skin. The cabin door was now open, inside, empty. No sign of the thing, no sound, just the extinguished fireplace, the chairs in place, as if nothing had happened, as if there had never been anything in there. But when Mariana grabbed Pedro's arm, her eyes were wide, fixed on the glass of the car parked in front of them. Pedro followed her gaze and froze. The reflection in the glass showed the cabin behind them. But in the reflection, the door was not open. In the reflection, someone was standing in the doorway, tall, thin, smiling, and before they could react, the voice whispered again. This time, coming from the car's radio, even though it was off. "Now I see all of you. If you're going to rent a cabin in the middle of nowhere, pay attention to the host's warnings. And for God's sake, don't look out the window. If you found this story disturbing, wait until you hear the next one." The worst kind of terror is the one that starts slowly. A strange detail here, a noise there, until suddenly you realize you're not alone anymore. That's how the story I was told began. It was shared with me by an acquaintance, someone who was never the sensationalist type. In fact, she hardly ever spoke about such topics. She only mentioned it because that night, after a few glasses of wine, the subject of hidden cameras came up in conversation. She took a deep breath before speaking. This happened to a friend of mine, Anna. At least that's what she let me call her. Anna had always been suspicious. The kind of person who double-checks if she locked the door before sleeping, covers her laptop webcam with tape, and turns off her phone when she feels someone might be listening. But on that trip, she tried to convince herself that she was overreacting. It was a charming Airbnb in a small town where she would spend the weekend alone. The host had good reviews. The place was beautiful, well decorated, nothing seemed off. But on the very first night, a discomfort arose. She couldn't explain exactly why, but the feeling was there. It wasn't noise, it wasn't smell, it wasn't something she could point at and say, "This is wrong." It was just a weight in the atmosphere, as if the air was too thick, as if something there was paying attention to her. At first, she ignored it. She turned on the TV to distract herself, but couldn't relax. She took a shower, but felt she needed to lock the bathroom door, something she never did when alone. Before going to sleep, she checked the room, opened the closet, looked under the bed, just to be sure, nothing. But still, it took her a while to fall asleep. On the second night, the paranoia truly began. She convinced herself it was all in her head, but still decided to take a better look around the house. She searched corners that nobody usually checks, behind pictures, inside light fixtures, in the crevices of furniture. She looked for anything strange, a tiny lens, a suspicious glimmer, a hole where there shouldn't be one. Nothing. That's when she had the idea to test the TV. Sounds like something out of a movie, right? But it's not. It's real. She opened the TV settings and started to poke around. She flipped through channels, checked for any odd options, until she found something that shouldn't be there. A nameless channel. No number. A black screen that for a few seconds seemed empty. But then the image appeared. Her heart raced. It was a room, small with white walls, lit by a dim yellowish light. It was the room she was staying in, and the camera was filming from an impossible angle, an overhead angle, from the ceiling, and there, right in the middle of the screen, Anna saw herself, sitting on the bed, holding the remote control. The delay in the transmission was minimal. When she blinked, the image on the TV blinked along with her. That's when she understood someone was watching. Anna froze. The remote control slipped from her hand and fell onto the mattress with a dull thud, but she didn't even blink. Her reflection on the screen made the same movement with an almost imperceptible delay. The camera was there somewhere above her, looking down. She held her breath and slowly raised her head, her eyes scanning the ceiling. No openings, no suspicious holes, nothing that hinted at a hidden lens. But she knew it was there. It had to be. That live image wasn't a recording, it was her at that very moment. If someone was watching, that meant that since she arrived, she had never been alone. The silence in the room felt heavy. The distant sound of the wind outside was the only thing breaking that sense of absolute emptiness. Anna felt a shiver run down her neck. Then something changed on the screen. The transmission trembled slightly as if the camera had been touched, the angle adjusted. Someone was moving it. Anna felt a chill in her stomach. The delay was small, but now she knew she was dealing with something worse than she had imagined. If she moved, if she ran, someone would see. Someone who, at that moment, might already be coming for her. What would you do? Run? Get out of there without looking back? Anna did none of that. She stood still. She tried to appear motionless enough so that, on the other side, whoever was watching wouldn't notice she knew, because, at that moment, she understood something. Say even worse, if there was a camera in the room. Maybe there were others too, maybe he had been watching since day one. Anna felt her heart pounding in her throat. Every cell in her body screamed for her to run, but her instinct told her otherwise. If he knew she knew what would happen, the TV screen still showed the image of the room, but something seemed different. The camera shook slightly, almost imperceptibly, as if someone were adjusting the focus. or trying to see better. Anna's mouth went dry. He was watching. Time felt dragged out, heavy. She needed to get out of there, but how? She couldn't just get up and run out the door. If that wasn't the only camera, if there were more scattered around the house, then he would see, he would know. So she pretended. She took the remote with the same calm as before, forcing her fingers not to tremble. She pressed a few random buttons as if she were just curious, playing with the settings. The image on the screen remained the same, but then a movement. Quick, small. Something passed at the edge of the screen. A shadow. Anna held her breath. The room she was in was closed, the door locked. There was no one there with her. So where had that shadow come from? The TV trembled again, and a low, almost imperceptible sound leaked from the speakers. A static noise. Distorted, followed by a muffled creak. Anna slowly turned her head towards the bedroom door. The sound was coming from outside. And then tap, tap, tap. 3 sharp knocks on the wood. Someone was there and knew she was awake. Anna didn't move, didn't breathe. The silence that followed those knocks was worse than the sound itself. A suffocating void, as if the whole world was holding its breath, along with her. The TV screen still displayed the image of the room, frozen like a distorted mirror of reality. But Anna no longer looked at it. Her eyes were fixed on the door, and then again, knock, knock, knock. The knocks were louder this time, not hurried nor impatient, deliberate, as if the person on the other side was testing something, testing. Her reaction. Anna felt a chill run down her spine. Slowly her eyes slid back to the TV. The room was still there, unmoving, but something seemed off. She blinked, confused. The angle had changed. Not by much, just a slight shift, a subtle tilt. But now the camera no longer focused solely on the bed. It was aimed directly at the door. Anna swallowed hard. The camera hadn't moved on its own. It was being adjusted by someone outside. Time seemed to stretch as Anna tried to think. Run? But where? If the stranger on the other side had been watching, from the start, he knew exactly where she could go. She sat still, forcing her face not to betray her panic. Maybe if she pretended to be asleep. But then, without warning, the doorknob turned. Slowly. With the calm of someone who knew they didn't need to rush, Anna couldn't control herself. She jumped out of bed. In that very moment, the TV turned off by itself. The room plunged into a cutting darkness, and in the absolute silence, she heard the breath of someone on the other side of the door. The silence stretched into what felt like hours. Anna remained there, motionless, her heart pounding against her ribs, her lungs burning from holding her breath for so long. But she dared not exhale, dared not move. The doorknob didn't turn again. No new knocks on the door, no voice, just that breath low, dragged out, patient. Then it stopped. Anna waited. 5 seconds. 10. Maybe it had left. Maybe creak, a noise. Not from the door, from the ceiling. Anna swallowed hard. Something inside her screamed not to look up. But she did. And there in the darkness, almost invisible in the gloom, a small hole in the wood, and something shining inside it. An eye, watching. She didn't scream. Couldn't. The shock was so strong that her legs finally obeyed and made her run. What happened next, Anna didn't quite remember. She only recalled unlocking the door and bolting through the dark house, not looking back, not caring if he was close, if he was coming after her. All she wanted was to get out of there. The front door opened too easily, as if it had already been unlocked, as if someone had been expecting her to try to escape. She ran to the car without thinking. Her hands trembled so much that it took an eternity to fit the key into the ignition. When she finally managed, she accelerated without looking in the rearview mirror. She didn't want to see. She didn't call the police. She didn't report the Airbnb. She didn't want to know who owned that house, because she knew that if she found out, he would also know about her. And since that night, every time Anna checks into a new place, she performs a simple test. She turns on the TV, checks the hidden channels, and if she finds something that shouldn't be there, she leaves without looking back. If you've ever rented an Airbnb, you might want to think twice before your next booking. How many hidden cameras go unnoticed? How many hosts, really, know everything about you